My name's John Zieger. I'm the executive director and one of the co-founders of Responsible Innovation Labs. And first, I want to say thanks to all of you who are coming and folks who are joining us over the course of this hour. We're excited for this conversation. Thanks especially to our guests, Tom Steyer and Astrid Atkinson. We will hear more about both of them over the course of this hour, but we couldn't be more excited about these two speakers and really this topic. You know, we started Responsible Innovation Labs because of a belief that innovation driven by ambitious technology companies is one of the most important forces shaping the world and one of the most important tools in humanity's toolkit. And there's no topic about which that is more important than climate change and the climate crisis. We sit at the nexus at RIL between founders and funders, and having these kinds of conversations is an important part of what it is we hope to do. So our exceptional speakers today, I think, will give us real insights into a critical area and a critical time, and we've got a lot to cover. So without any more kind of wind up, I will jump in. I will just a word on housekeeping first, which is if you have questions over the course of this hour, feel free to put them in the chat. We'll moderate them, and as we have opportunity, we'll ask our guests to weigh in on them. So feel free to do that at any point during the conversation. Tom, maybe let me start with you, if I can, which is on the topic of context, and really maybe help frame our conversation. Astrid will ask you kind of a similar question. I'll just say Jema Adams, my colleague, will jump in with some of the questions as well. But where are we at this point in time, Tom, in the climate crisis? Give us a little bit of the 10,000-foot view. There's been a lot of public policy that's happened in the last little while. There's a lot that's happening. Tell us about this moment. How do you think about timing? How do you think about where we are in this issue?
Thanks, John, and good morning. So when we think about framing this issue from a scientific standpoint, I think the easiest thing to do is to accept the UN kind of guidelines about where we move into extreme danger. And they've basically said if we go past 1.5 degrees Celsius, that we're moving into a place where we are going to be at severe risk. And they've also talked about 2 degrees Celsius. But let's talk for 1 second about 1.5 degrees Celsius. So at the current level of CO2 emissions, which is about 42 gigatons per year, we hit 1.5 C in 6 years, 6 months, and 4 days. So well before 2030. So when we think about the timing of this, we are talking about, people have said we need to reduce approximately 50% of CO2 emissions by 2030. We will hit at the existing level without any reductions or any increases. And by the way, CO2 went up in 21, 22. We will hit it in somewhere around 2028. And so that's our timing. Now, having said that, why do we care? I mean, let's also put into perspective why this timing matters and what we're trying to avoid. I mean, I tend to see this, and I got involved in this issue because of human suffering and potential human suffering at levels that are hard to describe. And, a lot of this gets expressed through water, floods, storms, droughts, some of it through fires, which we've seen in my home state of California, some of it through heat, that it's just unsafe to be outside at certain temperatures that are extreme, but which we're starting to hit. But basically, the example that I'd use from last year was Pakistan, where 33 million people, a third of the country, basically lost their homes because of a gigantic flood. And Pakistan has produced, by one estimate, 1/10% of the CO2 cumulative CO2 emissions. So one of the rules about this and why we care is whoever has done the least damage is at the most risk. It's very ironic and sad, but true. So That's our timing. That's what's at risk in my mind, which is suffering for billions of people at an unimaginable scale. That's why I care and why I think everybody, when they realize that, will care. I think it's also, so what, in terms of thinking about this problem, it's also solvable. It is a gigantic opportunity to rebuild the developed world in a new way, and also to build the developing world. You know, so if you look at India, for instance, they think there will be 5 times as much electricity generation in 2050 as there now, 5x. And how that's produced will have an important ramification for everybody on the planet. If you look at the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which has about somewhere between 95 to 100 million citizens, 10% of them have electricity. By 2050, they're going to have electricity, and whether that's generated in a clean way or from fossil fuels is going to have a dramatic impact on everybody in the planet. So there is a need to spend $4.5 trillion per year on this. We're spending about $1 trillion, just so to parameterize that. And the last thing I'd say is this, you know, I'm sitting in the United States. I think the other people on this call that I'm looking at are mostly sitting in the United States. We are about 11% of the CO2 emissions right now. We've said we're going to reduce it by approximately 50% by 2030. It's important to know Europe, which has said the similar thing, is 7%. We are going to have to export the technologies, export the money. This is going to be a global effort, because this is not going to get solved in the US and Europe from the standpoint of deployment, but the technologies that we can develop that win in the marketplace, pure and simple, so that people adopt them because they are better, cheaper, faster, are going to be an absolute critical part of a global solution. But the idea that that we can do this on our own is actually dead wrong. You know, the numbers I was just giving you, China is, and some of this math is a little murky, but the math is basically they're about 1/3 of CO2 emissions, China. So working with other countries in the world is going to absolutely have to happen. It's a global problem. It's a global solution. And that is a challenge that we're facing, but it's also an unbelievable opportunity to rebuild kind of the global infrastructure in a way that makes us safe and healthy.
As climate solutions and sort of the key insight.
Sure.
Where you're focused these days.
Well, you know, my old friend and business partner, Katie Hall, and I started a business about 1.5 years ago just to create investment vehicles that have positive climate impact. If it doesn't have positive climate impact, we're not interested. The basic point behind it was a couple of things. One is we're at the execution phase. Like, I had spent about a decade basically being an advocate for robust climate response. And I believe that argument, even though there's occasional flare-ups, is over. We have won that argument. We need a robust climate response. And, you know, even the Republican Party, which is the most recalcitrant party in the world on this subject, really doesn't make an argument about climate denial anymore. They really don't, because they can't, because it's silly. We are in the execution phase, and Katie and I both felt like, okay, what can we do to help bring investment acumen and money to this problem to make the transition happen faster? And it's going to happen, you know, across the different levels of stages of corporate development. So is it going to happen in the innovation economy, the venture, you know, capital world? Absolutely. That's going to be critical. Is it going to happen in terms of deployment of the existing technologies, the solar, wind, EVs, the stuff we already have? Absolutely. But, you know, it's going to happen. Are the existing emitters going to have to decarbonize? Absolutely. And they're going to need help doing it. And so there are really an awful lot of opportunities from an investment standpoint to absolutely get superior returns based on the fact that there's so much urgency here, there's such a strong tailwind that you're basically saying, this is not a nice to have. This is a have to have. This is a must have. And so there's some quest and in in the investment world, if you're trying to sell a new product, create revenue, it's, you can tell very quickly how people feel about it, because if it's a nice to have, you ain't getting the sale, because there isn't time enough to do nice to have. If it's a have to have, then you get it. And the other thing I'd say is this, and this is the last thing I'll say, capitalism scales. If you have a product that is substantially better and solves a real need, think about the cell phone. I think they asked McKinsey in 1986 how many cell phones there would be in the United States in 2000. And they're like, it's growing 25% a year. We expect that to continue. There are going to be 3 million cell phones in the United States in 2000. There were 300 million. Capitalism scales. And I hate saying this, but kindness does not scale. People are kind, but when it comes to putting out trillions of dollars, capitalism scales. And our point is we have to win in the marketplace over and over and over again, and basically rebuild this world in a way that protects human beings and protects human life. And that is, we are at that phase. And I always say to people, I'm doing exactly what I want to do. If I weren't doing this, I would be eating my heart out because I wanted to do
this. Maybe Tom, let me jump in with just one more there, and then Astrid, we'll turn it over to you for a similar set of questions, which is, how do you think about the public and private sector relationship right now? Obviously, we've had the Inflation Reduction Act, big investment potentially. So it feels like the moment is different. How important is that, and how do you think about it?
Yeah. So the way that the investment landscape works here, and the way that it works in every part of the economy, is the government sets the rules and the framework for investment and competition. And, just to step back for 1 second in terms of specifically climate, people talk about the market and, the free market, all of which in my mind is nonsense. Every market has rules and the government sets the rules. And so in this case, we've set a rule that you can pollute with CO2 and CO2 equivalents, and it's free. So there's a rule in the market that pollution is free. So therefore people pollute without any consideration. There's no such thing as a free market. There are rules. So what we're seeing is governments starting to put in changes to the market, like the Inflation Reduction Act, which is a gigantic incentive for people to deploy and create clean technologies. At the same time, there's different ways to run markets. So we've chosen to use effectively a carrot to say, if you do these things that have positive impacts, we will support you economically. So you have to put up less money to get it done. Therefore, it can get done faster with a higher probability of success. In Europe, they're using a very different way of changing the market, which is rules. They're saying we are going to charge you for emitting CO2. We are going to have border adjustments for people who create products outside of the EU and send them into the EU, where we charge you for the pollution associated with those products when they hit our border. So the way to think about this is the government's going to set the rules and the framework in different ways in different places. But in effect, all of those rules are going to be attempts to undo a huge market failure, which is the fact that we don't charge for pollution. And if you don't, I always say to people, if I'm a garbage collection company and you don't charge me for pollution, I will collect your garbage and stick it in John's yard and leave it there and we're good. And I can be the cheapest garbage collection because pollution is free. Every one of these frameworks is an attempt basically to undo the market failure, which is that pollution is free. And so what they're going to do is set up a framework, and then business has to figure out, okay, what's the best way to solve that problem? Like, we need to get rid of plastic pollution. Okay, there are different ways to do it. Everybody competes to do it in the cheapest, fastest, easiest way. And that scales. And so if you win in the marketplace, you produce the cheapest hydrogen that's cheaper than fossil fuels, you win. And that's what's going to go on, is that they're going to set up a framework for competition so that we can drive down these prices, so we can really scale these innovations and do it within the time frame, because there is true urgency here. You know, we have wasted so much time getting to the execution phase that our execution is going to have to be, in the nicest words, pretty darn crisp. And that's where we are, and that's why we're pushing. You know, that's why I'm pushing, and that's where I think we all need to be, is we need to get this done in real time, in real size. And I personally think we're going to do it, but it's not going to be, a walk in the woods.
That's a great transition, I think, over to Astrid, and that's your story. You're doing it, and so maybe tell us a little bit about your transition, how you think about this moment, kind of why you're doing what you're doing, and just a little about your transition story.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think like many folks, and probably most folks on this call, the impetus for me to make a change into the climate space was really kind of thinking about, impacts for me, for my family, for the world as well, but also just kind of looking at the severity of the climate challenge that we're facing, alongside the timelines for, and my son is 10 now, and he's going to be about 37 in 2050. We're supposed to be done by then. And that means that that's not our kids' job, it's our job. So that was kind of the place where I started when I was thinking about what I wanted to do next. Now, I had been at Google for a long time. I joined in 2004 and had ultimately stayed there for about 15 years. So I was at a place in my career where I had the sort of the luxury to make some choices. And I think that that's also a place where, once you start to think about how you really want to be spending your time, depending on what your motivations look like and these kinds of things, at least for me, there was a little voice in the back of my head that was like, okay, but are you going to stress about climate change, or are you going to help? I'm always happier when I'm doing something than when I'm worrying. So I was like, okay, well, I guess I'm going to need to try to help. And I want to offer a little bit of framing for how I thought about this, because I do think the framing piece is really important when you're evaluating a change. One of the places that I started trying to understand the climate landscape overall was Project Drawdown has a really good kind of general overview of climate solution spaces, where they've attempted to really kind of inventory the broader landscape of all of the climate things that we need to do and prioritize them. Now, that's just kind of one perspective, but it's a really useful one because it's very broad. And so if you want to get an easy inventory of what are all of the things that we could think of as climate solutions, some of them are unexpected. Education for women and girls is on their top 10 list. And there are reasons for that, which I won't go into here, but it's really worth taking a look, because I think it can help expand your sense of what climate solutions consist of. So that was one of the places that I started. And then the other question that I was asking myself is basically, I feel like if you want to really make an impact on something that you care about, finding a place where your individual skills and strengths and background are kind of a unique advantage is always the best way, right? So the question for me was, given my background, which at the time was in large scale computing, software engineering leadership, computing reliability models, and kind of global cloud computing, where in the climate solution space is that particularly and uniquely valuable? So that was kind of where I started when I was inventorying the options. I'm not a materials scientist. I wasn't going to be working on battery technology. I'm not particularly experienced with like forestry or agriculture. And so, for me, those were, well, interesting spaces, not necessarily going to be the best fit for me. And so I was looking for tech solutions, and I got interested pretty early in the energy and grid space. Now, if you look at the kind of overview of climate solutions, about 2/3 of the mitigation challenge is in the energy sector. The remaining third is things like land use, agriculture, et cetera. That's not exact, but it's about that. And when we look at the energy problem space, it breaks down a little bit further. And there's basically kind of a two-step solution set in the energy space. Step one is electrify everything. Step two is transition all users of energy to clean electricity. So there's a piece of this which is about transitioning existing direct fossil fuel usage from everything from transportation to heat to electricity generation over to all using electricity. And then the other piece of this is making sure that our sources of electricity are clean. Now, there's a hidden piece of this, which is that when we think about how that's going to work, electricity is something that in general exists as part of a broader network. And in particular, when we look at the solutions that can give us, basically clean sources of electricity, we're looking at things like renewables, hydro, nuclear. That's kind of the core technology set. Arguably, we have most of what we need, probably not all, but most of what we need to transition our electricity sources to clean energy today. And that's good because any new technology, especially in the hard tech sector, is going to take probably 10 to 20 years to productionize and really kind of get the costs working and get it out at scale. And so when we look at the timelines that Tom described, we really are going to do something, we're going to make serious progress on our energy landscape transitioning to clean sources within the next 10 years. That is going to be done with existing technology. And so then you kind of have your question of like, okay, well, what does that really look like? And that's kind of where I got interested in the grid. Because if we think about transitioning everything to clean electricity, the grid is the platform that makes that possible. It is the network asset that we need that connects all sources of electricity production to all sources of electricity demand. It's really good that we have it, because if we had to build that, that'd be really difficult. But the one that the thing about that is that the grid that we have today is quite a bit short of where it's going to need to be. There are some things that are advantages as we look at this transition. One of them is that there's about a 40% efficiency loss in burning fossil fuels to boil water to generate electricity. And similarly for burning fossil fuels directly to power cars and so forth. So as soon as we start to make that transition to direct electricity sources, we get an efficiency gain along with that. So the scale of the problem is immediately a little bit smaller than it might otherwise be, but it's still a really big challenge. We need to transition this entire system. And it's not just the physical network of the grid. It's not just the generators. It's not just how we consume electricity. It's the whole system. And we need to transition it very, very quickly. And we need to do that in a way that is not just better, and not just quickly, but also fundamentally a lot cheaper, or it's not going to work. And so when we start to look at that challenge, you're looking at kind of the scale of investment that we would need to make in our energy system and in our electrical grid to make that possible. And it is really a ton of money that needs to go into this space in a hurry to make the grid into the platform that we need it to be, to link all of our clean energy sources to all of our locations where energy is used. And so that's where I got really excited, because in my heart, I'm a distributed systems software engineer and systems engineer. I ran operations teams at Google. I ran the team that kept Google's homepage up and running for about 5 years. So if you went to Google between 2007 and 2012 and it was up, that was at least partly me. And so when I was starting to think about the challenges and the solution spaces, I saw a lot of parallels between some of the technology approaches that we had developed in the context of running really big computing systems at Google, which was really all about getting reliable behavior out of massively distributed systems that are spread across the globe connected by physical networks, which have capacity constraints, and the challenges associated with transforming the grid. And so that's kind of how, my early question of like, what are all the solutions that one could tackle, kind of connected through to, it's kind of me personally and where I saw my opportunity to contribute. And I hope that helps a little bit with framing for how one might approach looking at this kind of transition.
Absolutely. And grateful to you both for sort of setting the stage and giving us a little bit about your own personal journey. I actually wanted to keep going on that front. So thinking about our audience who are at various levels of interest and knowledge and expertise, Astrid, you talked about Project Drawdown, for example, and we've got that in our resources we'll be sending out. So don't worry, everyone, you've got some links to click later. But I'd love to ask you both, what is your process, to get up to speed on things you don't already know deeply about? And both of both as founders and investors, and that, there's a lot of those in this audience. Tell us more about that process. Astrid, you first, please.
Sure. So I think that the process of transitioning into a field you don't yet know a lot about can be a really intimidating one. I had the opportunity to switch kind of areas of expertise a few times while I was at Google. And I remember the first time I changed jobs after I'd been doing the same thing for about 7 years. And that was really kind of my first like long stint in my career where I'd been doing the same thing for a long time and I'd gotten very good at it. That process of sitting down on a Monday morning and looking at emails containing a ton of words that I did not know, acronyms that just sort of kept flying past, concepts I had no frame of reference for, was initially really intimidating. But the process of diving in and really starting to engage with, finding materials that can provide background information, Googling acronyms, use Google a lot, actually, looking up terms that I don't already know. I think there's a few good techniques around just coming up to speed in unfamiliar areas that are, you're looking for framing materials is one of the reasons I brought up Drawdown initially. There's a lot of really good podcasts in the energy space, and that was something that was a really great resource for me because it was something I could listen to while I was in my car. So it was also a way to learn about climate while I was doing my day job. The ones that really stood out to me were the Energy Transition Show, Interchange, the Energy Gang at the time. They've changed hosts, but they're still very good. There's a lot more now, and starting to just like really spend a good chunk of my time every day listening to people talk about the problems in the space I wanted to move into, helped me to understand the language, how people talk about the space I wanted to move into, how the concepts that they use, how they frame it. How it's always, I think, really helpful to begin to understand how people on the inside of a problem space talk about the problems that you're engaging with. But just kind of linking it back to that experience of shifting jobs a few times at Google, what I found was that the first time it was terrifying, and then I picked it up and it was kind of fun. And then the second time it was a bit less terrifying because I'd done it recently and it wasn't such a big change. And by the third time, I was like, actually, this is a big part of the appeal. Like coming up to speed rapidly on something that's new is actually really invigorating, right? Like suddenly you're thinking about all kinds of new stuff. You've got all these new ideas. You're starting to link together concepts across domains. And so I already had a bit of practice with that by the time I was looking to shift into climate. But I also was really benefiting from the fact that, I had been researching and spending my spare time, thinking about and learning about, listening to, interacting with folks in the climate space for quite a long time before I really kind of got serious about making that change myself. The other thing I want to mention really quickly is that a really big part of my process was finding people to talk to, both to make human connections and also to learn from them the kind of framing and problem space and language and so forth that they use in their area of expertise. So I actually just got really boring at parties for probably about 5 years. People would be like, "Hey, Astrid, how are you?" And I would tell them, "Great, I'm really interested in energy. Do you know anyone who works in it?" just like very old fashioned networking. Recruiters would call me offering jobs. I'd be like, don't want that job. Do you have any energy ones? And then I would talk to people who were willing to take my call. One of the nice things about working in the climate space is that if you ask someone for 45 minutes of their time, many people will say yes. And in that way, I found that the human community associated with the energy and climate space was also really rewarding and really appealing. So I think like that is something that wouldn't underestimate. The power of just talking to people is huge.
This is good stuff. Tom, how about you? How do you get up to speed? What are you looking for?
Well, look, I think Astrid did a really good job on this. And I think of it in a lot of the same ways, which is, I think you can get comfortable in terms of deep background by reading a lot and listening to podcasts. And I think that gives you the confidence to understand. I mean, people have spent all their time trying to figure out how to express this so you can take advantage of the people who did Project Drawdown, which took years. You can take advantage of all the work they put into it. You can, I think one of the really good books is Speed and Scale, which goes through I think in a very granular fashion, solutions to the different parts of this problem from a tech standpoint. There are a couple other things I would really recommend, but I think that Astrid's point is that gives you the confidence and the background. Then you can have conversations with people. And I think what Astrid said was really true. I would add, in addition, for me, particularly because this is a mission-driven space, you can end up, the generosity that Astrid was describing can really bleed into friendship. So that in fact, if you end up with real friends in this, you can say to them, by the way, I have absolutely no idea what this means. Do you understand it? And they can go like, oh yeah, I can help you with that. So the other thing I think that's true is it becomes a lot more comfortable as you go along, because you're no longer in effect talking to strangers. Now you're talking to people that you share something with that's important for them and that you find also important enough to change your life. And the last thing I'd say is this. I always say, if you want to know something about the horses in the 4th race at Aqueduct, put $5 on the nose of one of those horses, because it's going to force you, when you have something at stake, it's no longer just theory. You're now talking about, very specifically what's going to happen in this race, dependent on, whether it rains and how long the track is and who the other horses are. And I think that when you work on specific problems, it brings everything else into focus. So maybe you're not able to use all of that deep background that you may have. Astrid was talking about, there's a lot of stuff about women in Project Drawdown. And that's something that is not, something that's normally talked about in terms of climate, at least in terms of the huge impact that it has across a couple of different vectors. But I think working on specific problems, to me, I just love doing that, because all of a sudden you're like really comparing in the real world, how is this going to work? And it brings you, at least it brings my small mind, into focus really fast. And then you get to use all the other stuff that you've pulled together and really start to learn, I think, in my mind, that's the exciting fun part.
So that's a great kind of jumping off point to one of the next questions I wanted to ask you both, which is maybe just to say a little bit more about, let's put ourselves in the shoes of who I think at least a lot of the folks in this audience are, which is people who are seriously contemplating, can I do this? Can I make this change? And what, and so, necessarily need to go from the general to the specific. It's not the abstract problem. It's a specific company. It's a specific role. What are the places that you kind of, what would your map, if you were in that place, kind of what's your map? How do you think about, hey, these are technologies, maybe even some companies that I think, are exciting, interesting places where there's really an opportunity for people to dig in. Just help us double click a little bit more on that, and feel free, either of you, to jump in on that one.
Astrid, would you rather go first? I don't care. I'm happy to do it, whichever is better for you.
Yeah, so I think looking at specific kind of categories of opportunities and also specific companies is a good place to start. And for me, my background was in software, and so I was looking for opportunities that were also in software. If you are, if you're a lawyer, if you're a project manager, if you are working in human resources, if you're a teacher, the opportunities are going to look a little different, and in some ways are perhaps broader, because those jobs can extend into spaces that are not necessarily like software tech per se. But having said that, most businesses are also software businesses. One of the challenges that I ran into, though, was that there is a difference between sort of big tech, Silicon Valley type software companies versus companies that also have software as a component. And coming out of Google, I was kind of spoiled. Like, I was used to working in a place where software engineering was really valued and understood, and was kind of the heart of the business. And I was looking for that and that kind of culture and that kind of honestly really creative approach to building software-based solutions in whatever I did next. And then I ran into the problem that there weren't that many actual software businesses in the space I wanted to move into. And this is ultimately why I ended up starting my own company, but it was partly in the hope that it would help to blaze a trail for others who were looking for the same kinds of opportunities. And my company is far from the only one. So I'm just going to name a couple of other companies that I think are really exciting. And they kind of range from small to large. One thing to consider is that if you're currently at a large company like Google or Amazon or Apple or Microsoft, there are parts of those companies that work in climate solutions, and they're definitely worth considering. But there's a lot of smaller companies that are really exciting. And just a few, in the kind of customer device and electrification space. Span.io does smart panels, really interesting technology to replace home electrical panels with basically a control point for the house. Fervo Energy does geothermal and kind of new geothermal exploration tech. I think they're really cool. There's a few other companies in the grid landscape that I really like. So some of them are competitors of ours or friends. I don't really think of it as being competitive because we're kind of collectively fighting climate change, not each other. But Energy Hub is good. WeaveGrid does EV charge management. Utilidata does edge computing and smart meters. There's some companies doing really interesting mapping tech. So there's this one, Kairos, I think is the name of it, that basically has a technology, puts a sensor on a low-flying plane and then will fly it over an area to detect methane leaks. I'm particularly excited about that one because if we look at like ways to manage warming in the short term, mitigating methane leakage is actually a really significant lever that we can pull, because methane is about 25 times more powerful than carbon as a warming gas, and it lasts less time in the atmosphere. So if we stop emitting it, it will come out of the atmosphere much more quickly than carbon will, and potentially have like an outsized warming impact. So I think that one is like actually really cool as a combination of like hard tech and software. There's really good ones in like circular economy and waste management. A lot of the really interesting companies of about our stage or a little later are portfolio siblings of ours, with Congruent, one of our main investors, who specialize in clean tech early stage. They started investing in the most recent cohort a couple of years before we came along. Those companies have grown up. So kind of, I don't get paid for this, but like go check out their portfolio page. A lot of really good companies in there, not just ours. But I hope that gives people some ideas of like kind of the range of companies doing different things out there as well. We're fortunate to have a lot more opportunities in the kind of tech space than there were even 3 years ago when I started my company.
Tom, yeah, kind of sectors.
I'd love to talk about this because obviously I thought what Astrid said was super interesting and relevant. But I tend to think, when I think about people who are changing here, I start with what Astrid said, which is, what is your background? because there's no reason if you're a lawyer to suddenly go back and become an engineer. There's no reason to get rid of your existing capability. The question you have to ask yourself is, where can I bring my capability to bear most effectively? Because that's going to be the place where you're going to have the best, most interesting job. And so for people who are in an existing company, the first question I would ask is, we're going to have to decarbonize the existing world. So if you're working for a big emitter, the question is, can you bring a different attitude to that company? So because decarbonizing existing emitters is a gigantic boon for society. And constructive engagement within those companies is something that absolutely has to happen and will have huge ramifications. Now, let me say this, that may not be possible. You have to ask yourself, and I'll give you an example of one. Look, the 4 big US banks probably do more fossil fuel lending than anyone else in the world. I mean, that's the statistics. It's just true. And, they also do a lot of lending for clean energy and for, some of the decarbonizing technologies. But the truth is that they do the frontier energy development around the world, fossil fuel development, and they lend to all these big projects. And so the question is, if you're a banker and you say, okay, like Astrid, I feel like this is a problem I need to work on directly. You can do that as a banker. You can try and change the culture of your existing firm, or you can go to banks, lending operations, investment firms who are specifically designed to do that, and they exist. So, in all of these things, if you're a banker, if you're a lawyer, okay, there are a million great places for legal minds to go to work within corporations and in different aspects working on this problem. And, Astrid was talking about the kind of innovation economy, the new technologies that we have to develop and bring to bear and deploy in order for this to work. And that's absolutely critical. But there's the existing firms that are going to have to, and I'll give you an example of something that most of this will combine technology with new technology with existing business. But, just the built environment, all the buildings in the United States, we're not going to rebuild. We're not going to scrape all the buildings in the United States and rebuild them between now and 2050. That is 100% not happening. But are they going to have to change the way they use heating and lighting and air conditioning? Yes. And so you can be a real estate person and be the innovative real estate person whose buildings actually are net zero. And, figure out how that works and be the leading person. So in every one of these things, in my mind, thinking about this, the right way to think about it is exactly what Astrid did, say, what are my capabilities? What are the things that I can do? What are the things that I like to do? And what is the part of society where I can do that? Not everybody's going to go to work in a startup. And so, I have a friend who works at a big IOU that involves a bunch of coal. And he was like, I am going to reduce that to 0. And that is going to be my contribution in terms of this fight, Tom. And I'm like, do it. That's fantastic. There's a lot of complexity in that because people actually need that electricity. So how that works in a way that you're good 24/7, 365, on a way that doesn't raise people's electricity bills, there's a lot of complexity to that. And that is a huge contribution. And that's the way I think people to think. If you're a teacher, figure out how your teaching is now going to be pushing towards this. I say to everybody, you're a climate person. You may not want to be a climate person. You may wish we didn't have this problem. It would be great if we didn't have this problem, but everybody is in this and you have to figure out how you're going to contribute in your way. And it's going to be very broadly, it's sort of like, and I think Astrid made this point really well too. It's not like there's software companies or internet companies. Everybody uses software. Everybody's on the internet. Well, everybody's going to be a climate person.
I think just to tie into that a little bit, one thing that's important to keep in mind is that the climate solution space is very, very broad, and you don't need to solve climate change to make a positive impact.
Yeah.
None of us are going to do that individually, but to Tom's point, picking a thing and working on it has a tremendous amount of power. You can get one thing done, and that has a material positive impact. And I think that in some ways, there's some privilege to being alive at this moment in time, where there's the opportunity to have such an outsized effect on what the future will look like. Almost anything you could choose to do in the climate space is a positive thing that will make the world a little bit better.
It's hearing strongly, get in the game. And we'll move to some of the questions from our fabulous audience. And I'll add a reminder that this is your last chance to get to these fabulous folks. So if there are other burning questions on your mind, please type those in the Q&A. Two good ones to call out. So one is on this point exactly. So for you, Astrid, a question from a software engineer working on distributed backend systems and wondering, where can I find those similar hard problems? Which sectors are there specific things? The challenge of using your brain in that way. I imagine there are.
Yeah, I mean, if you're a software engineer, then looking for problems that have a strong software component, I think is a good first step. And to Tom's point, that's a little bit broader than just like software. That could be companies doing innovative green banking. That could be companies doing data work. Some of the solution spaces around things like agriculture and forestry and so forth are, I think, really fertile ground. Sorry. For bringing in big data approaches and modern data techniques. That's true, I think, really broadly across the board for any approaches that are looking at transforming existing industries. So if you're a software person, thinking about the places where data could be really transformational is often a good place to start, because when you need to deal with a lot of data, typically implies you need software systems to manage it, and that it is receptive to innovative approaches, including opportunities to try out new machine learning approaches and AI technologies and things like that, which is something that is often a priority to software engineers earlier in career, who are both looking for a way to work on problems they care about, but also for jobs that will help them continue to grow in their field of specialty. Which is certainly a consideration for folks, especially when they're closer to the start of their career.
Right. Well, and Tom, they're combining two good questions that are more in your wheelhouse. So for the less technical among us, where are some great opportunities? And Perry wants to know specifically in the policy and advocacy world, how can we accelerate it from that perspective?
How can we accelerate the policy and advocacy? Well, look, to a very large extent, I think people understand what policies would be most impactful. And in the United States of America, it's, there's a very sharp distinction between policy and politics. And policy is what you would design if you were God and could make the rules, in your living room with your most trusted friends and comrades. And politics is what you can actually do in the real world. To a very large extent here and around the world, the question is not policy, but politics. And, you can look, just so there's a great MIT program where you can put in all the different policy changes and see what the impact is on temperature around the world. It's super fun to play, just so you know, because it basically, parameterizes the impact of a bunch of ideas. And some of the ideas that sound great, you put them in the computer and you go like, okay, that one doesn't matter. I'm not going to spend my life on that one. But to my mind, it really has become a question of what you can accomplish politically. That's why I spent so much time trying to push politically, to change the conversation, to push, the United States to a place where we recognize, period, this has to happen. So all we're arguing about is how to make it happen. And if you ask me, that is the place where there is infinite opportunity. It's hard. It requires, real dedication. And, you have to have resolve to hang in through thick and thin. But I believe that is the place, if you're really interested in making a difference in terms of the public part of this, that is the place where I think you can make the most difference. I think the policy part of this, people have thought about this very, very deeply, and all those solutions are, sitting on somebody's hard drive waiting to be implemented, but getting them implemented at the federal level, at the state level, across the world, that is really, really hard. And that is where I believe if that's the place where you want to put your effort, that's where I think it's most profitably spent.
One other thing that I'd just like to suggest for people who are interested in policy and advocacy is that if you're new to that space and you're interested in getting engaged in it, every community has places where you can engage with climate solutions locally. And that's really good practice. And I think helps to really help develop that muscle of knowing how to engage in issues in ways that are productive. And you can scale up from your community to your state. But there's a lot of need for local activism and local action. And that's not just like setting emissions targets. That's also things like engaging with public transit policy, engaging with housing policy, looking at solutions within the community for things like pollution, waste management, education, et cetera. There are, like Tom said,
there's a million places where we need change.
Absolutely.
No, thank you. And that really gets to the last two questions. So we have successfully, thank you everybody for great questions. Now I have the privilege of offering the last word to our fabulous speakers. So Tom, I'm going to start with you. If you could leave our folks with the one thing that they could prioritize in their personal transition, what would you prioritize today?
So I think the most important thing to keep in mind in terms of both changing how you're orienting your professional life, but how you're thinking about this problem is don't be reasonable. There is an assumption that the status quo is reasonable, and everybody in the status quo, including everybody in oil and gas and coal, will tell you this is the way it has to be. We're the big boys. You guys are talking about stuff that doesn't make sense in the real world. And you have to take that and throw it right out the window, because we do not have a choice in this. We have done things in the past many different ways. We have the ability to do this in a clean, healthy, sustainable way. And you have to take the idea that the people running the existing systems are making good decisions, are strategically correct. And every time they say we have to go slower, you have to take that and throw it out the window. And I'd say the last thing I'd say in terms of this is, that's really the essence of the letter from Birmingham jail for Martin Luther King, where they said, basically, we recognize it's a problem, but you're going way too fast, Martin. And he was like, really, 450 years? You think we're moving too fast here? And I would say here, look, we don't have time. For all the people who we have to keep doing it this way. There's no way to make the change. You have to take that and accept that, no, we can make the change and that you can be part of it. So when you think about it, give yourself some credit. Think big about where you can make a real difference, because that's the thing that will be really fun. Then you'll be right in the middle of doing something important, revolutionary, that actually creates the change that we all need. And that's the attitude you've got to bring to this problem.
I think just tying into that as well, one of the things that I carried away from my time in big tech was the idea that it's almost as hard to make a small change as it is to make a really big change. So if you're going to spend your time on something, it might as well be the biggest thing you could possibly do. And so I think that's perhaps just restating Tom's point in another way, but There's a quote that I like, which I just looked up, and I'm going to read it to you, that I find really applicable to climate change. And this is from JFK. I think he was talking about the space program at the time. Says, our problems are man-made, therefore they can be solved by men, and men can be as big as he wants. No problem of human destiny is beyond human beings. Now, if we swap out men for people, I think that idea that there is no problem that we face that we can't address is a really powerful one. We are the creators of the world that we live in. We are the shapers of our own destiny. It can sometimes seem hard from an individual position to see, where the opportunities are that make those big differences. But as we talked about earlier, picking something that you care about and working to make a difference with it is almost the most powerful action that you can take. The other thing that I would offer is that it's always going to be more helpful and more impactful to do this with your job and all of your time than it is to do it, on the weekends or as a hobby. But the kind of happy corollary that I would give you to that is that it can feel really disempowering to sit there kind of reading about problems on Twitter. The world is full of problems. And if you want, you can spend all of your time learning more about them. It is really empowering to take any actions at all. Getting out in your community, figuring out what the solution spaces look like, engaging people who are working on these problems today, super exciting and really positive. It is a much nicer way to spend your time. And so, in some ways, making any action, let's say that you make a job change, maybe it's not the right job change, but you made an action and you learned something. The next job you take doesn't have to be the one that will fix climate change, but choosing a direction and moving in it gives you the opportunity to learn from experience. And it is tremendously empowering to take an action in your own life to address the things that you care about.
What an extraordinary conversation. And I think, I couldn't be more grateful for that message. I think that is very much what we wanted to leave folks with, which was a sense that it's a big problem, but there's a place that if you are privileged enough to have the kinds of skills that work in the technology industry or investing in it or other things, you have an opportunity to make an impact. And there's lots of practical advice here on ways you can do that. So thank you so much, Tom. Thank you so much, Astrid. I wish we would have had another hour. I feel like there's a lot more we could have gotten into, and it's certainly a big topic, and hopefully we'll have other opportunities to chat together. But thanks to our audience. And we hope we will send out some follow-up with some of the notes on some of the things that were discussed today. So hopefully you can follow up on those. But again, thanks for being here and for the great conversation.